went to film school, so you don't have to, and today we're going to talk about frame rate and how it affects your footage. Frame rate affects motion, mood, and how your overall footage feels. Selecting a frame rate can really determine how your footage comes across to the viewer, and it also depends on the frame rate you decide to screen it back. The usual cinematic standard is 24 frames per second in the US and 25 frames per second in PAL regions such as Europe. These frame rates were actually determined based on broadcast signals and what was easier to broadcast to TVs through antennae. Another reason that we chose the 24 frames per second is that paired with the 180-degree shutter, it creates the naturalistic motion blur that we see in everyday life. It was also cheaper to produce because film was very expensive, so shooting at a lower number of frames per second was convenient and more economic. After the 1930s, when 24 frames per second became the cinema standard, a lot of projection methods were based off of this number, and therefore that is what we still use today. However, you can choose more artistic frames per second depending on what you want for your footage. Shooting at 60 frames per second is the standard for slow motion. How this works is you shoot at 60 frames per second and then you play it back at 24 frames per second. It elongates what 1 second of action would be to 2.5 seconds. You can choose different frames per second for even slower motion if you so choose, such as 120 frames per second. So higher frame rates are not just for slow motion. They also affect the motion blur that your footage comes with. For example, a higher number of frames per second freezes motion, and it creates sharper motion with less motion blur. This is very often used for sports or car videography. If you have any sort of races and you want to make sure that every detail is captured to fractions of a second, shooting at a lower number of frames per second can create a sort of choppy or staccato motion. The lower number of frames per second, the more reminiscent it is of older stop-motion videos. It is most often used to create a sense of fractured time and being sort of disconnected from reality. It's very important to discuss the differences between a lower shutter speed and a lower frame rate. A lower shutter speed blends motion together, it is smooth, it is often dreamlike. However, a low frames per second makes a very stuttered sort of motion. It is a very chaotic and fast and disoriented passage of time. It's used in Saving Private Ryan, so be sure not to confuse them if you ever choose to use any of these stylistic effects.